Greetings. I want to introduce this commentary that I'm going to be undertaking on part of the Jewish Holy Scriptures, known as the Tanakh. The word Tanakh, of course, means the three letters of the parts of the Hebrew canon, namely the Torah, which are the books of wisdom or instruction associated with Moses, and consist of the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The first 5 books of Moses. I won't be commenting on them because this has already been done in the Zohar, the great Kabbalistic commentary that was first rediscovered, shall we say, in medieval Spain. Gershom Scholem ascribed it to Moses de Leon, and certainly he was one of the redactors. It's certain that it included much oral tradition that he had inherited, and that had survived in the Jewish community right from the days of ancient times onwards. The Kabbalah, of course, being the oral teachings that are handed down concerning the nature of Jewish scriptures, and they have many profound insights to share. But there's no point in reinventing the wheel, so I'm not going to comment on the Torah. I'm also not going to be commenting on the next part of the Tanakh, namely the Nevi'im, the books of the prophets, partly because many other people have commented on them, and partly because the complexity of the historical context in which the prophetic revelations were given during the time of Israel and Judea and so on, would require huge amounts of historical explanation and background. And whilst fascinating and instructive, I think readers and listeners can go to the enormous numbers of biblical commentaries that already exist, and the works of scholarship that exist. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump to the Ketuvim, which is the third part of the Jewish canon. Ketuvim standing for the writings. And this is the section of the Hebrew Scriptures that, in a sense, have some of the more timeless wisdom elements to them, and I think are of universal significance to mankind as a whole, and the spiritual wisdom and enlightenment of mankind as a whole is the purpose of my recording this commentary. And the prophets on the whole spoke specifically to the context and situation in which they lived, to the particular tribal communities of Israel as they found them at their time. And the Torah spoke specifically again to the context in which Moses lived, and in that, although of course there is universal significance in both those earlier sections of the Hebrew Scriptures. And that was the purpose of the Zohar and other commentaries to expound. It's in the Ketuvim that we are going to find the kind of eternal and universal significance of the witness of Israel to the rest of mankind. And since the purpose of these commentaries, of which there are 3 underway at the moment, namely the commentary on the Jewish writings of the Tanakh, the commentary on the Qur'an and the Islamic teachings contained therein, and the commentary on the New Testament, the Christian writings. The purpose being to reconcile and create the possibility of some kind of peace accord on the metaphysical and religious plane between these 3 great religions of the Middle East. I'm undertaking this work as a peace scholar, as a historian of ideas, a philosopher, and a teacher of comparative religion for many years. So I'm bringing to bear in this commentary the apparatus, if you want, that I've developed over those decades of study and research into those 3 great religious traditions of mankind. The methodology I adopt is that of transpersonal history, which is the combination of transpersonal psychology associated with Jung, Wilber, and many others, which I wrote up in my doctoral thesis for the University of London. And the combination of that approach with conventional historical studies, scientific, historical, archaeological, and textual and scientific historiography as we know it, and including paleography in the context of the Old Testament stroke, the Ketuvim that we're going to be looking at. Now, I should say a little bit by way of introduction before I start the commentary, and I'm going to be working through the following books: the Book of Psalms, Book of Proverbs, Book of Job, the Song of Songs, Book of Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Book of Daniel, the Book of Ezra, Nehemiah, and the books of Chronicles, to which I may append, if there's time, some commentaries on various apocryphal and apocalyptic Jewish texts after that period. So, before I start with the commentary on the Psalms, I want to just say a little bit about my studies in the history of Judaism and where I'm coming from theologically and historically and in terms of religious studies into Judaism. If anyone's interested in more details, obviously I've written this up to some extent in my autobiographical works, but I just want to say very briefly, as I say, the purpose of recording this commentary is to advance peace and interreligious understanding between members of the Jewish community, whether secular or religious, and members of other faiths, particularly Islam, which is obviously a dominant and important religion in the modern state of Israel and also in surrounding countries, but also among Christians who, in a sense, are mediators, natural mediators between Judaism and Islam. And I think that the more we study each of these three traditions, the more it sheds light on each other's perspectives. It's like the view from three surrounding hills, if you want, in the changing show of the seasons and the times of day, and the shadows and lights are all reflecting each other. And my own role is that of a kind of hermeneutic translator, going between the different hills of perspective or vision and seeing things through the eyes of either the Islamic or the Jewish or the Christian perspective. Now, my role as a scholar has been also to engage existentially with these perspectives. I don't think you can have a true encounter with the noumenal, the transpersonal dimension, unless you actually inhabit it, unless you get inside the skin of the particular way of seeing things. So, over many years, I've also engaged deeply with, let's say, the spiritual witness that emanates from the Jewish tradition. And I first undertook really a serious study of Judaism in my time in Canada when I was studying between 1977 and 1981. This is when I first read the Jewish commentaries and discovered the Talmud and the rabbinical teachings of Judaism, and also first encountered the Kabbalah. I mean, I'd never encountered that at school, growing up partly in Montreal and then in Brighton, in Sussex, in England. Teachers of religious studies and so on never revealed there was such a thing as esoteric Judaism. I went to Brighton College, a Christian Anglican school, and a Christian primary school, St Mark's in Kemp Town, and we were never taught the connections between Judaism and Christianity. There was no hint that Christ might have been coming from a mystical tradition that already existed in Judaism. When I discovered the Kabbalah and the complexity and profundity of its teachings, it hit me like a lightning bolt that this was actually the origin of Christianity. I remember studying this in Canada. I discovered I was deeply interested in the history of language and philology, having studied philosophy at the University of Bristol already by then, under Professor Stephen Corner, the great Kantian scholar. And there was a very strong Wittgensteinian influence on the department at that time, in the mid-70s. And through Wittgenstein I learned the limits of metaphysics, in a sense. It was a very tough lesson to learn. And through the study of Austin and people, the linguistic philosophers of Oxford, it was impressed upon me that it's in the study of language that the job of philosophy is conducted. By analysing and teasing apart the inner meanings of words, you can get to the philosophical kernel at the heart of any given speech utterance. And this inspired me then to say, okay, well, if that's true, we have to understand all the languages of the planet. Philosophy is a multilingual job. We can't just do this in English. That was something, that is logical. So this led me to an interest in all different languages, in Sanskrit, in Pali, the Buddhist texts, in Chinese, and I began a study of world religious literature. And I tried to learn as much of the vocabulary of the traditional language that they were originally written in as possible. So this led me to the beginning of the study of Hebrew, when it came to the study of the Jewish scriptures. And this is when I realized that in the Kabbalah there's this profound and ancient love affair going on between scholars, rabbis, and commentators, and the sounds and shapes and forms that the words and letters take. The Kabbalah is about a most minute, intimate love affair between consciousness and revelation in the external form that the word takes. So a Kabbalist will look at one word from the Hebrew scriptures and could spend literally a lifetime teasing out the significance of the shapes. It's a Kabbalistic scholar is like a lover, and the word is like the goddess for him, the epiphany of beauty. And just as a lover would gaze at his beloved for eons and find every little part of her body entrancing and delightful, so a Kabbalist likewise looks at a word, a single word in the Hebrew language, as the Shekinah made manifest, and can tease out infinite numbers of layers of meaning and interpretations and wisdom. Now, nobody had ever told me that such a thing was possible. This was, if you want, the hidden text behind the tradition of Western esoteric philosophy and religion and mysticism. As the more I discovered about the Kabbalah, the more I realized this was the key to the wisdom traditions of a large part of mankind, because it's not only there in the Christian tradition, and I discovered there's this whole tradition of what's called the Christian Kabbalah, associated with people like Guillaume Postel in France, and John Dee, and Reuchlin, and Pico della Mirandola, and many of the great Renaissance scholars of the Proto-Enlightenment, who then later led on to the full-blown Enlightenment through the Rosicrucian epoch, talked about by Dame Frances Yates. So there's a continuity between the Kabbalistic wisdom of interpreting life according to the levels or domains of being, and then the later Enlightenment in Europe, which was a Jewish Christian project. The great scholars and mystics and saints and sages who underpin the work of Kant, Goethe, Hegel, etc., and Voltaire and the philosophes and Herbert of Cherbury and Hume and Adam Smith and the idea that rationality can actually work out what existence is, which leads straight on to Marx and Freud. What I realised is there is a continuity between the Kabbalistic project, which is decoding reality, and the Enlightenment project of science, Newton and Marx and so on, trying to decode physical reality and social reality, and trying to and having the audacity to say reason can somehow work this out, and we have a moral duty to do so. That's the scientific project. And the University of London was an exemplar of that project, the work of scientists, and this goes straight down to Darwin and the decoding of DNA, the notion of nuclear physics, that we can work out what all these different quanta are doing to create material reality. Now, what I realized is that in Judaism, this has been a very, very ancient project, and what we know as the Kabbalah is really a vast forest of wisdom learnings, which have been going on for millennia. And if you trace back the origins of this, and you ask, well, why? Why in Judaism is this tradition going on? I think I've been led in my own studies to certain conclusions, namely that this love affair between sound and meaning, form and emptiness, has been going on in all cultures. It's not unique to Judaism. You have the same thing in the Celtic tradition of Druidry, the love of the letters which were associated with different trees. You have the same in Sanskrit, where the different sounds have mantric qualities and were used in spells and prayers and so on, and meditation. You have the same thing in Chinese and every single language tradition. What was important about the Kabbalah and in Judaism was that this was at the epicenter where the alphabet was invented. So the idea of the alphabetic script actually came into being specifically among the Western Semitic peoples, the Phoenicians and the Aramaic and the Hebrew tribes, before anywhere else in the history of the planet. And it spread out from there elsewhere. So it's incredibly interesting and important to, in a sense, realize that the Kabbalah encodes the oral tradition that predated the existence of the alphabet, and yet did so in a way that then the alphabet becomes the code-bearing vehicle of that more ancient and esoteric wisdom. Now, Abraham, a very important figure in the transmission of Judaism according to the Torah, but also of Islamic and Christian wisdom, lived around about 1700 BC, historically, which is exactly the time the alphabet was being invented and created by peoples very similar to Abraham. And in a sense, Abraham's journeys are stylistically similar to the journeys that underlay the creators of the alphabet, because what happened was these Western Semitic peoples, the Phoenicians and Arameans, wandered among the local established civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, and to a lesser extent in the Hittite realms, and saw these settled peoples using pictograms for speech concepts. And it took a very long time to master, say, the Egyptian hieroglyphs. You had to join the priesthood and study for decades before you could really understand what's going on. The same with the cuneiform writings of Babylonia. They were effectively stylized pictograms indented on clay with wooden spatulas or metal that imprinted stylistic pictograms. What the genius of the people of the bridging realm, which is the region of the the coastal regions of Phoenicia and what was to become Israel, was that that was the region through which everybody passed, and so they had to invent a new kind of way of recording knowledge. And they hit on this brilliant idea of, let's have a pictogram for each sound. So a, b, k, d, f, etc. And by making a glyph for each sound rather than for the idea, you could then use that same script to encode any spoken sound system or language. And that was the origin of the alphabet. About 1700 BC, and scholars have dug up, traces of this, found scratchings on caves in the Sinai, and can trace how these glyphs then became associated with particular sounds. So, bait, the letter B, was drawn to look like a house, which was shaped in a kind of square way that looked like a house. Bait, the letter B. And then whenever in a speech tradition or language you encounter that sound b, you can use that glyph for it. Now, this idea was absolutely revolutionary. It was apparently, seemingly, uniquely an invention of these people at that time and place. And I would say it's a unique occurrence in the history of mankind. And I would also say, therefore, it's not at all surprising that it's exactly in that area that the most ancient scriptural texts of wisdom teachings are then found, namely the Bible and the Tanakh, the Old Testament scriptures of the Jews, they are the living remnant, if you want, of the people who had that brilliant idea. Because although the Phoenicians probably predated, well, we know that the Phoenicians actually invented this idea. It was the hinterland tribes of Hebrews who then actually borrowed the idea and made it their own. And the Aramaic tribes as well, to which Abraham belonged, very soon got hold of it. So if you want, the Hebrews and Arameans are like landlocked Phoenicians, and the languages are very, very close. So all this means that the ancient wisdom that predated alphabetic knowledge is encoded in the Kabbalah, and that's to do with lived experience, oral experience, and ultimately spiritual experience. Now, so to our understanding of Judaism, we have to bring now all the fruits of scientific studies into the nature of religious experience, and decode, if you want, from the texts what Abraham, Jacob, and all the other heroes and characters of the Bible might have actually been like as human beings and as people. And that is a fascinating job. In my commentary, I'll be drawing on work in transpersonal psychology, which was Abraham Maslow and others, building on the work of Jung and Freud, have developed in the latter part of the 20th century as a psychological equivalent to the Sephiroth, really, the understanding that there's many dimensions of being, and that to try and reduce reality to any one level of being is a false project. On Brighton Pier, there are many different stalls selling different things and games and entertainments, and some of them have sweet jars, and they contain blue or yellow or red sweets. You can't put the whole of Brighton Pier into one of the sweet jars. You can't reduce the complexity of ultimate realities, plural, the Elohim, into just a kind of narrow perspective framework. So this is where transdisciplinarity comes in, multi-level analysis and interdisciplinarity. And this is what the humanities are about as a scholarly enterprise. And this is what transpersonal history is about. Anyway, I began this detailed study of the Jewish scriptures and the Kabbalah in Canada from 77 to 81. I continued it when I was nursing at the Hospital of Nervous Diseases in Queen's Square in London in the early 80s. At this time also I was studying at the British Museum in London, and then the London Library. So I was using the resources of the British Library and the London Library. In those days the British Library was still at the British Museum. And absolutely in love with the resources of London as a scholarly centre for studies. And immersed myself deeply into the study of the Kabbalah, amongst every other branch of sacred learning. And really what I was trying to do was to find the universal Kabbalah underlying all languages, not just Hebrew. The hypothesis I was chasing was that there is a common root to all language systems, and that if we study deeply the Kabbalah within all traditions, Sanskrit, Celtic, Gaelic, etc., you'll find the common roots and origins. This led me to the profound intuition, which I think can be scientifically backed, that the Indo-European language families and the Semitic language families ultimately go back to a primary source